Founded in 1862, the Union Pacific Railroad operates on over 32,200 miles of tracks in 23 states. This railway travels through central Arkansas, more specifically the small town of Alexander. It was late Saturday night on August 23, 1987, when two boys, 17-year-old Don Henry and 16-year-old Kevin Ives, went out late with a spotlight and a rifle to engage in a hunting practice known as spotlighting, and never came home. Now, I love bunnies and small animals, so I'm not going to get into what spotlighting is, but Curtis Henry, Don's father, didn't know that the practice was illegal and thought the boys would be alright. What truly happened between the last sighting of the boys and when they were discovered has been speculated and contended for decades, but a few facts remain undisputed. Around 4:30 in the morning of Sunday, August 24th, hours before the sun yet had a chance to peek over the horizon, the mile-long 75-car Union Pacific freight train was en route to Little Rock, Arkansas. Stephen Schroyer, the engineer, now spotted Don and Kevin motionless on the tracks where they were only 100 yards away. Schroyer cried out, "Oh my God," as he realized what was bound to happen. He sounded the horn, but the kids remained stationary. They were laying in between the tracks with their feet over the rails. Schroyer has remained tortured by the indelible memory of that night whenever he discussed the tragedy. The four witnesses on the train said the boys were laying side by side across the tracks, hands down at their sides and covered by a green tarp. Unable to divert its course, the train engaged the emergency brake, but the massive freight still bounded forward for half a mile until it halted, running over the two teens. Those aboard the train considered themselves responsible for ending the boys' lives. Don and Kevin were horrendously mangled. An autopsy performed later by defamed medical examiner Fahmy Malik erroneously divulged the kids had 20 joints worth of marijuana in their systems and said the psychedelic substance was responsible for rendering the kids unable to wake up. He also stated that marijuana was a narcotic. Deputy Rick Elmendorf was quick to accept the medical examiner's ruling. A newspaper article promptly used the deaths to vilify pot smokers, saying it was a clear example of how deadly marijuana was, and that pot smokers didn't want to, quote, upset their dream world. But herein lies the problem. At a decibel of 98, it's hard to believe that no matter how much pot someone smoked, if any, they would be able to sleep through a train coming at them at full force. It's the equivalent of sleeping in your bed while someone jackhammers a pillow next to you. On a quiet country night in an area like this, a freight train can be heard from over 6 miles away. So why were these kids, who were about to start vocational training at their senior year of high school at Bryant High in 2 days, able to sleep through a train coming at them? Because they were dead or knocked unconscious before the mile-long, 6,000-ton cargo train even had a chance to hit them. The following is a chronological deep dive into the events preceding and following the night that permanently changed the lives of two families and the townspeople in the surrounding area. These events may appear to be a bit disparate, but the connections that are interwoven in this giant and terrifying web of corruption are hard to dismiss and even harder to stomach. Some of the occurrences are not exactly correct in this timeline, but I tried and it's a lot of research to do, so please don't judge me. If I'm incorrect about any of this timeline or the events that took place, anyone is welcome to correct me in the comment section below. On June 25th, 1984, two young men, Billy Don Hainline and Dennis Stecker, 26 and 21 respectively, were killed in a strikingly similar way to Don Henry and Kevin Ives. The young Hogden men were found dead on part of the Kansas City Southern Railroad only a couple hours away from Alexander, where the deaths of Kevin and Don took place. Police said the two men were drunk and passed out on the railroad tracks. I don't know why law enforcement officers in the 80s seemed to think young men were thoughtless enough to slumber on the railroad instead of sleeping literally anywhere else on Earth, but that was their story. The men's blood alcohol level was still under the legal limit for intoxication. Coincidentally, about a month after the deaths in '84, a makeshift meth lab was found a little over a mile away from the death site. The case was reopened 13 months later during the following summer of '85. But the Oklahoma Bureau of Investigation decided no foul play was indicated in the deaths of Billy and Dennis. Their cases were closed and no one was ever formally charged or found to be responsible. In 1986, Alger Berryman Seal, known as Barry Seal, a member of the Medellin cartel, was prepared to testify in Arkansas against 29 people that were indicted on drug charges. but he was shot to death before he could do so. After further complications, the grand jury was shut down and no formal indictments were issued. Barry was originally an American commercial airline pilot who became entangled in the cartel, and after being convicted of smuggling drugs, he became an informant for the DEA. He piloted planes from South America to Mena, Arkansas, where a cargo plane was engineered with a removable door to drop drugs and money from planes to the ground. This may not sound relevant, but give it time because it will. A week before Dawn's and Kevin's deaths, a man with military fatigues had been spotted around the death site. Officer Danny Allen questioned the suspicious man, and the man fired at the officer. Officer Allen requested backup, but neither responding officers nor the officer himself could locate the suspicious man. Witnesses also reported another instance of a man in fatigues near the train accident site on the night of the boys' deaths. He was spotted nearly 200 yards from where the boys' bodies were located, and the man was never found. Now a bit more about Dawn and Kevin. In the late summer night of 1987, they were normal kids and best friends. They worked in their cars, rode around town, and just hung out like kids do. If you're from a town that lacks variation and excitement, you can most likely surmise what it was like for youths back then. Don Henry was described as outgoing, extroverted, always happy and smiling. His friend Kevin Ives was noted as being more introverted and quiet and serious. Don was a funny kid, and Kevin always laughed at his jokes. They complimented each other. Taking a break from their normal routine of weekend double dates, Don and Kevin met up with some other friends on the outskirts of Little Rock. They went their separate ways a little after midnight and made it back to Don's house 12:15 a.m. Kevin waited outside on the porch while Don grabbed the spotlight and his rifle, his prized possession. Don's father, Curtis Henry, said, quote, "We talked approximately 15 minutes before he left." End quote. It was the last time they ever spoke. Surely, if Curtis had any inclination of what was to come, he would have begged the boys to stay inside that night. The tracks ran behind the Henry household, and it was a favorite spot for the kids to hunt. And there's something magical about those late weekend nights when you're a kid. When the sun goes down, the world changes into a different place. On a warm night with compatriots, life is exciting. But after Curtis Henry saw his son, Don's and Kevin's last moments were numbered. When Stephen Schroyer saw the two teens laying on the track about 3 hours later, he said they were just laid out. Parallel to them was Don's .22 rifle. Conductor Jerry Tomlin was struck and noted how relaxed the bodies seemed. Their feet laid across the tracks on his side of the engine. He noticed neither one of them flinched a muscle, even after the horn was sounded. Many people speculated the green tarp draped over them was to camouflage the boys and make them easier to hit. Linda Ives said, quote, "One of the crew saw where it landed and shined a light on it and informed Saline County Sheriff's Office where it was. Saline County Sheriff's Office assured us they would personally interview the train crew rather than rely on the railroad investigator's report." End quote. The investigation took a mere 4 hours to complete, and Sheriff James Steed never showed up on the scene. Another party discovered Kevin's severed foot at the tracks, overlooked by the police's truly effortless investigation. Conductor Tomlin himself said he was struck by the carelessness of responding officers. He also stated he did not get the sense police were actually searching for clues. The local paper subsequently quoted Chief Deputy Rick Elmendorf as saying, quote, "We haven't ruled out anything except foul play," end quote. He also stated the rifle was not loaded when the boys were crushed. Newspapers repeatedly and emphatically stated police assured everyone that no foul play was involved. It appeared in multiple newspapers day after day, week after week. Larry Ives, Kevin's father, said Don and Kevin saw something they shouldn't have, most likely a drug deal or something of the like. After the case aired on an episode of Unsolved Mysteries in 1988, witnesses called in and stated that the deaths of the teens were related to drug trafficking. Even the townspeople in Alexander were aware of what was going on. Another witness, a man leaving a nightclub, Bryant local Ronnie Godwin, came forward after the investigation was reopened and said he saw what appeared to be 2 law enforcement officers beating up 2 boys in a grocery store parking lot. The local man sat and waited, watching the officers pull off in an unmarked car and later drove in the direction of the railroad tracks. Another witness said that he saw 2 boys getting beaten up by 2 cops. Kevin's father, Larry Ives, was an engineer himself. He had been the engineer on the route in which his boy and Dawn were killed. There was indeed a possibility that Larry Ives would have been aboard the train that struck and mangled his own son had he not switched routes just 2 months earlier, before that late summer night. Sheriff Jim Steed convened a conversation with the ME, Fahmy Malek, and discussed the best way in which to relay the kids' deaths to the public. Fahmy offered to rule the deaths as suicide, but the sheriff said no one would buy it, so the medical examiner ruled the deaths as accidental. Using a testament for urine on the teen's blood, Fahmy made the fabrication that the 2 teens had smoked the equivalent of 20 joints and were so high that not even some of the loudest noises on the planet could have woken them. For a reference to Fahmy's brilliance and thorough work, he said one victim in another case committed suicide when he was shot 5 times in the chest, and another young man's cause of death was an ulcer when he was decapitated. Both parents questioned the findings of the investigation. The Ives family also hired a private investigator who worked tirelessly to get to the bottom of the case, but the local officials resisted his efforts and offered no help to solve the case. The PI suggested a court order would help Linda obtain some useful information, but after she did so, she was told there was no official EMT report from the night of the crash. Linda had prior talked with the shaken paramedic who refused to give details about his report, but he stated he spent 5 hours writing down details about the deaths. Linda did later obtain a report written by a different EMT from the man she initially spoke to, which had blatant indiscretions from her initial discussion with that other EMT. But one absorbing factor was how the boys' blood looked like it was absent of oxygen in it, an indication that they were dead before the train hit them. But lo and behold, now the case came to a dead stop. 5 months after the deaths, the family held a press conference that successfully and officially enabled the case to reopen the next day. A new prosecutor was appointed to the case, Deputy Prosecutor Richard Garrett, who claimed he would bring anyone responsible for the crimes to justice. Friend of Garrett, Prosecutor Dan Harmon, assured the families of the boys he'd do anything in his power to get to the bottom of what happened. Dan Harmon and Richard Garrett are extremely important figures in this case, and not because they're altruistic good doers, but because after their appointment is when witnesses who came forward in the case began to die. Another ME who was appointed exhumed the boys' bodies and found evidence that one boy was dead and the other was unconscious before they were obliterated by the train. He also discovered that the boys smoked between 1 to 3 joints between the 2 of them, so possibly a half a joint to a joint and a half each, substantially less than the 20 that Malek indicated initially. Keith Coney was a good friend of Kevin Ives and Don Henry, who claimed he was actually with them the night that they died, and he now feared for his life. He told his friends and family that 2 law enforcement officers were indeed responsible for the double murder of his friends, but he was either too afraid to tell who it was, or he didn't know their names when his mother questioned him about it. On May 17, 1988, his throat was cut during an altercation, most likely by the assailant responsible for the Ives-Henry murder, and he fled the pursuer on his motorcycle. He ended up crashing and dying. No person was ever held responsible for Coney's death. There was no formal autopsy or investigation, and his murder is still unsolved. A grand jury changed the ruling of the medical examiner's cause of death from accidental to probable homicide in July 1988. Prosecutor Garrett claimed to focus on the green tarp, how it got there, where it came from, why it was there, being that it did not belong to either of the victims. Some police officers said they were never told about the tarp, and some said the 4 witnesses on board the train imagined it. Nevertheless, the green tarp was never located or analyzed, and officers made no effort to protect the crime scene whatsoever. Another expert pathologist analyzed Kevin's t-shirt from the night of his death, and they found knife marks on the back. He was most likely the boy who was dead before the train came. This is when the grand jury reconvened and changed their cause of death from probable homicide to definite homicide. Joseph Burton was the new ME on the case, and he also discovered that Malek had sawed Kevin's skull so many times in so many different directions, he had mutilated it and made it impossible to tell where the original fractures were. He also dismantled Kevin's mandible. 2 other forensic pathologists and 7 forensic investigators reviewed the case and said they believed the boys were murdered. Several people later came forward, stating that they heard 2 gunshots before the train collided with the teens. Police said they were going to test Don's .22 to see if he fired the shots or if they came from his gun, but surprisingly, just kidding, not surprisingly at all, the police never tested it. Malik falsified evidence in over 20 cases. Instead of firing Malik for his discrepancies, he got a raise. In November of 1988, Keith McCaskill was witness number 2 to die. In other words, get murdered. He claimed he was at the tracks of the 1987 train deaths and turned over information to Prosecutor Garrett. Afterward, he made his funeral arrangements, told his family goodbye, and was subsequently stabbed 113 times. Ronald Shane Smith was later charged and sentenced to only 10 years for the murder. It is suspected that Smith was paid to kill this witness. Prosecutor Garrett said McCaskill was probably suffering from paranoia, and no one else was involved in his murder. Around this time, Clinton was governor of Arkansas and said he lacked the authority to do anything about the case or the MENA drug trafficking problem, and as president, he didn't do anything to solve the case either. I'm a bit apprehensive to divulge too much into his involvement in the case because it's difficult to talk about well-known political figures without sounding like a conspiracy theorist, and I don't think he's ever officially been indicted or charged with any of these particular crimes. But there are lots of opinions and articles about him out there if you want to do some further digging. But had he not been involved with this case and did try to fix it or put other people in jail for anything like that, he most likely would have been murdered like pretty much every other witness who came forward. Garrett's position and posture as prosecutor was interesting because he did divulge facts of the case to Robert Stack during a follow-up interview of Unsolved Mysteries. He was also later arrested on drug charges, but he said there was surely a cover-up underway after the deaths of the teens. He said it could be as small as a vagrant murdering Kevin and Dawn, or as big as concealment that law enforcement officers conducted. Also, because of Richard Garrett's involvement with Unsolved Mysteries, all the callers' tips went through him. He was able to identify and track down the callers and make sure that they didn't say anything with the threats of violence and more. Now, there is a distinct possibility that these boys got wind of something going on in their small town and used spotlight hunting as a ruse for investigating the drug drops themselves. Like I said earlier, there wasn't a lot going on in their town, and the prospect of the airplane drug drops could have excited them, and going hunting would have been a believable ploy as to why they needed to take a rifle out at night, and it would have aided in their protection. Curtis never would have questioned it. On the last day of the year, in 1988, the grand jury investigation came to a standstill under Garrett Harmon and the presiding judge, John Cole, which prevented the jurors from hearing the findings in the final report. Greg Collins was killed in January of 1989. He was another witness who failed to appear after being subpoenaed because he was murdered by a shotgun blast to the face. Booney Bearden was killed in March of 1989. He was a friend of Gregory Collins and Keith Coney. An anonymous caller reported his murder, and his shirt was found where it was reported to have happened. His body was actually never discovered, the case was never solved, and he has been missing for decades. Jeff Rhodes was killed in April of 1989 after he told his family that he knew too much about the Henry Ives double murder, as well as McCaskill's murder. After being shot in the head like so many others in this case, his body was set on fire in a dumpster. Another grand jury witness, Richard Winters, was killed on July 20th, 1989 during an apparent staged robbery that was used to mask his murder. In March of 1990, the newly appointed prosecutor, Jean Duffy, was put in charge of a drug task force, but ordered not to use the task force to investigate any presiding public official. But her team did discover that prolific public officials in her district were involved in drug trafficking. Duffy's undercover officer concluded that Don Henry's and Kevin Ives' death were drug-related, but they were also solvable. Duffy's drug task force honed in on prosecutors Garrett and Harmon, the main focus of the investigation. The people that Mother Linda Ives confided in and felt solace in knowing were on the case were the ones responsible for her son's death and the death of his best friend. Dan Harmon actually became the prosecutor-elect for 3 major counties, including Saline, the county in which Alexander was a part of. He used his power and his friends in the press to launch a smear campaign on Jean Duffy. In the end, government officials above Duffy weren't able to help her through the controversy, and she lost her job because she did her job. Harmon later called for a grand jury to investigate Jean Duffy, but the truth prevailed in this instance and she was not indicted. But she was subpoenaed, and he forced her to turn over information about the case to him and his other cronies. Her mother overheard a phone call that she would be killed in jail if she were arrested for not turning in information. But Jean Duffy refused to answer, and when Judge Cole ordered an illegal felony warrant for her arrest for failing to appear, she fled the jurisdiction to save her life. The grand jury was actually ready to hand down indictments to those who deserved them, but U.S. Attorney Chuck Banks announced that no warrants would be issued for corrupt officials, and the grand jury's investigation of the county's corruption was to be shut down. Dan Harmon and other public officials that were wrapped up in the corruption involving drugs and murder were cleared and left unscathed, because no one told the grand jury that they actually had the authority to hand down indictments on their own. Jordan Kettleson was a convicted dealer suspected to be connected to McCaskill's murder, and he was also shot in the head in June of 1990. There was not even time for an autopsy because he was quickly cremated. His death was claimed to be a suicide, but we know it most likely wasn't. In July of 1990, one of Duffy's undercover officers developed evidence that linked the train deaths to public officials and drugs, and because she nearly solved the heinous murders and was able to uncover such odious crimes that her colleagues were enmeshed in, Jean Duffy's task force was shut down. In February of 1993, the Ives family asked the new sheriff in Saline County to reopen the case. The new detective, John Brown, was given the assignment, but John's immediate supervisor told him to leave the case alone. John was concerned after the conversation, but he became disturbed when he looked into the case. There were no crime scene photos, no list of evidence, and it looked like a lot of files were missing or probably destroyed. He contacted several witnesses, including Charlene Wilson, a woman whom Harlan turned on to drugs, who is now in jail. Harmon had arrested her and sentenced her to 30 years in jail as a form of retaliation because Charlene named Harmon as being involved with drugs. He said to her, "If you ever bring my name up, I will take you down. You're going to prison." It was her first time being arrested on an alleged drug charge. Charlene said she was at the tracks with prosecutor Dan Harmon the night the boys were murdered. She said, "I do know the boys were watching the drop site and they got curious as to what was being dropped there." Mike Samples was a grand jury witness who was also shot to death in June of 1995. A credible rumor stated that Samples was involved in fetching drugs that were dropped via airplane. Of course, authorities denied any relation between Mike Samples' deaths and the Henry Ives murders. Linda Ives said there was fear these people would implicate powerful figures and needed to be taken out before they could do so. The murder site of the boys on the tracks was also known as Drop Site A12. 4 pilots corroborated this and the fact that the boys were killed in a well-known drug drop site. Witnesses reported low-flying planes that would drop drugs and money from the sky. The media reported on the deaths of the 2 teens relentlessly until it became known that local government officials were involved. Then they didn't care so much. Or they were just absolutely terrified to do anything about it. Don Harmon was rightfully and thankfully later disbarred in 1999. He was convicted of using his position and power to obtain money and sex and arrested on drug charges. He was also known for being violently abusive to several women and stealing drugs. Within the last few years, wrestler Billy Jack Haynes came forward. He was contracted by the drug lords to work security at the drop sites. Though he's never been charged with the crime, he had nothing to gain from coming forward, and so many others who did try to help right the wrongs of the corruption case in the state of Arkansas were killed. Decades before her death, Linda Ives said, quote, "This is not a political issue with me. Our lives revolved around the ball field and going to the lake and all the things that a family does until the Arkansas political machine reached into our lives and destroyed the tranquility that we had," end quote. Although some have been charged with drug crimes and the like, many lived wonderful lives for quite some time and rose to higher ranks in their cushioned jobs. It is a fact that we most likely would never have heard the names of Kevin Ives and Don Henry had it not been for these heinous crimes that no one has answered to this day. And it would have been better that way. No one knows how the boys would have changed the world with their lives, but they certainly exposed part of the crime-laden underbelly of the southeast region with their deaths. They would be in their early 50s now, perhaps with teenagers of their own, and they would perhaps still be friends. But they were ripped out of this world before they ever had a chance to live. And the worst part of their deaths, aside from the fact it was so brutal and destroyed the hearts of so many loved ones, is that their ends were carried out by the very hands that were supposed to protect them. That in itself is not only heartbreaking, but it is also downright terrifying.